I remember the exact moment my life shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was a Tuesday evening in June, somewhere between Amarillo and Lubbock, when I heard that sound, the sickening crunch of metal twisting, the hiss of steam escaping, and then silence, the kind of silence that swallows everything whole. My father's truck, the only thing of value I owned in this world, sat there on the shoulder of Highway 84, smoke pouring from the engine like the last breath of a dying animal. I stood beside it, hands shaking, knowing that what just died wasn't just a vehicle. It was my future. My son's future. Everything. My name is Jack Morris, and this is the story of how losing everything became the beginning of everything. See, that truck wasn't just transportation. It was my inheritance, my business, my pride, and the last connection I had to my old man who died believing I'd make something of myself. I was 34 years old, a single father with an 8-year-old boy depending on me, hauling small loads between farms and ranches, barely scraping by but still standing, still fighting. But when that engine seized up, and the mechanic told me it would cost more to fix than the truck was worth, I felt something inside me break too. They say rock bottom has a basement. I found mine in a $40 a week motel room on the edge of town, eating cold sandwiches and staring at water stains on the ceiling, wondering if this was it, if this was how my story ended. A failed trucker with empty pockets and a son who deserved so much better. But here's what nobody tells you about hitting bottom. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're actually made of. Sometimes the crash isn't the end of the road. Sometimes it's just the turn you needed to take. Because 5 years later, I wasn't driving a broken-down truck anymore. I was running Morris Freight and Logistics, one of the biggest transport companies in Texas, with a fleet of 37 vehicles and a team of drivers who, just like me, had been counted out by everyone else. This is the story of that journey. From the wreckage to the empire, from nothing to something. And I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. The hunger, the humiliation, the small victories that nobody saw, and the one conversation that changed everything. Because if a washed-up trucker with a dead engine and $12 in his pocket can build something real, then maybe you can too. So let me take you back to that shoulder on Highway 84, where my old life ended and something new was about to begin. The Texas sun doesn't apologize for anything. It just burns everything in its path and moves on. That evening, as I watched the tow truck haul away my father's Freightliner, I felt that heat on the back of my neck like a brand marking me as a failure. The driver didn't say much, just hooked up the chains, gave me a sympathetic nod and drove off with the last piece of my livelihood rattling behind him. I stood there on that empty highway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Cars passed by without slowing down. Nobody stops for a man standing alone on the side of the road in West Texas. You're just another piece of the landscape, another cautionary tale waiting to be forgotten. The walk back to town was 7 miles. I made it in 2 hours, my work boots kicking up dust with every step. My phone buzzing in my pocket with texts I couldn't bring myself to read. Overdue rent notices, late payment warnings, a message from my ex-wife asking when I'd have money for school supplies. Each vibration felt like another nail in the coffin. When I finally reached the Sunset Motel, the pink neon sign flickering against the darkening sky, I felt something I'd never felt before. Not sadness, not anger, just emptiness, like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that made me want to keep going. Room 14 smelled like cigarettes and broken dreams. The bed sagged in the middle. The TV only got 3 channels, and the bathroom faucet dripped with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop a reminder that time was passing, and I was stuck. I sat on the edge of that bed and pulled out my wallet. $12.37. A photo of my son, Tommy, grinning with his 2 front teeth missing. And my father's old CDL license, creased and faded, tucked behind everything else like a prayer I'd stopped believing in. Dad had driven trucks for 31 years, through ice storms in Montana, desert heat in Arizona, and every kind of hell the road could throw at him. When he died 3 years ago, he left me that Freightliner and a single piece of advice scrawled on a napkin I found in the glove box. Keep the wheels turning, Jackie. A moving truck is a living truck. Well, the wheels weren't turning anymore. And I wasn't sure I was living either. That first night was the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the engine seizing up, heard that terrible grinding sound, felt the steering wheel go loose in my hands. I'd pulled over just in time. 5 more seconds and I might have rolled, might have died right there on Highway 84. And what would have happened to Tommy then? The thought made my stomach turn. By morning, reality set in with the cruelty of daylight. I had no truck, no income, no plan. The insurance payout wouldn't cover a replacement, not even close. The bank account showed $73. Rent was due in 11 days. And Tommy was counting on me to pick him up from his mother's place on Friday for our weekend together. I couldn't show up empty-handed again. Couldn't look into those 8-year-old eyes and explain why Daddy couldn't afford pizza this time. Why we'd be eating gas station sandwiches in the motel room instead of going to the movies like I'd promised. But what choice did I have? I spent that week doing something I swore I'd never do. I asked for help. I walked into every business in town with a handwritten resume and a story nobody wanted to hear. Gas stations, warehouses, fast food joints. Most didn't even let me finish talking before telling me they weren't hiring. One manager actually laughed when I told him I used to run my own routes. Used to, he said, smirking. That's the key word, isn't it? I wanted to punch him. Instead, I thanked him for his time and walked out with my head down and my pride somewhere around my ankles. By Thursday, I was desperate enough to try the mechanic shops. That's where I met Mike Peterson, owner of Peterson's Automotive on the industrial edge of town. He was 60-something, built like a barrel, with grease under his fingernails and a silver star tattoo on his forearm. I walked into his shop around noon, the smell of motor oil and welding smoke hitting me like a wave of nostalgia. Mike was under a Honda Civic, cursing at something in Spanish. "Help you?" He grunted without coming out. "Looking for work," I said. "Any work. I can turn a wrench, change oil, sweep floors, whatever you need." He rolled out on his creeper, looked me up and down, and wiped his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his hands. "You a mechanic?" "I'm a trucker. Was a trucker. But I grew up in my dad's garage. I know my way around an engine." Mike studied me for a long moment, his eyes sharp despite the wrinkles around them. "You look hungry," he said finally. "I am. Good. Hungry men work hard. $8 an hour, cash at the end of each day. You start now." I nearly cried right there in front of him. Instead, I nodded and picked up a socket wrench. That night, I walked back to the Sunset Motel with $64 in my pocket and calluses forming on my palms. It wasn't much. It wasn't even close to what I used to make. But it was something. And something was better than nothing. Working at Mike's shop wasn't glamorous. It was dirty, exhausting, and humbling in ways I didn't know I needed. Every morning, I'd wake up at 5:30 in that depressing motel room, take a cold shower because the hot water heater was busted, and walk 40 minutes to the shop. My hands were always covered in grease. My back ached from crawling under cars all day, and my bank account grew so slowly it felt like watching paint dry in the desert. But I showed up. Every single day. Even when my body screamed at me to stay in bed. Even when the voice in my head whispered that this wasn't enough, that I'd never climb out of this hole. Mike didn't talk much those first few weeks. He'd grunt instructions, toss me keys, and disappear into his office with a thermos of coffee that smelled like it could strip paint. But he watched me. I could feel his eyes tracking my movements, testing me, waiting for me to quit like I'm sure so many others had before. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. The other guys at the shop were decent enough. There was Carlos, a kid barely 20 who could diagnose an engine problem just by listening to it run. And Ray, an older black man with Vietnam stories he'd only tell after his third beer. They didn't ask too many questions about why a trucker was changing oil filters for minimum wage. In places like Mike's shop, everyone had a story they didn't want to tell. Friday came, and I picked up Tommy from his mother's apartment across town. I'd managed to save enough for a cheap pizza and a rental movie. We ate in the motel room sitting on that sagging bed, and he told me about school and his new friend Marcus and how he wanted to be a race car driver when he grew up. "Not a truck driver like Grandpa?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He scrunched up his nose. "Trucks are slow, Dad. I want to go fast." I laughed, but it hurt, because all I'd ever known was trucks, And look where it got me. After Tommy fell asleep, I sat in the bathroom with the door closed so the light wouldn't wake him, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. The man looking back at me was older than 34. He had dark circles under his eyes, a scruffy beard I couldn't afford to shave properly, and a look of defeat that settled into his bones. "You're better than this?" I whispered to that stranger in the mirror, but I didn't believe it. Weeks turned into months. Summer heat gave way to fall winds. I moved from changing oil to doing brake jobs, from brake jobs to transmission work. Mike started trusting me with bigger repairs, which meant slightly bigger paychecks. I moved out of the Sunset Motel into a cheaper place, a studio apartment above a laundromat where the smell of detergent never quite left my clothes. It wasn't much, but it had a kitchen, and that meant I could finally cook real meals for Tommy on our weekends together. One October evening after closing time, I was organizing tools in the back of the shop when Mike appeared in the doorway, backlit by the security light in the parking lot. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. "Back where?" "The road. Trucking." I stopped what I was doing. Nobody had asked me that question directly before. "Every day," I admitted. "But thinking about it doesn't change the fact that I can't afford a truck. Can't get approved for a loan. Can't do anything except what I'm doing right now." Mike nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer. He pulled a folding chair over and sat down with a grunt. "I used to drive," he said. "Long haul, coast to coast. Did it for 15 years before I opened this place." I turned to face him fully. This was the most personal thing Mike had ever shared. "Why'd you stop?" "Got tired of being alone, tired of truck stops and bad coffee and sleeping in a cab. Wanted to build something that stayed in one place." He paused, his calloused hands folded in his lap. "But I miss it sometimes. The freedom, the open road. That feeling of going somewhere, you know." I knew exactly what he meant. "Here's what I learned, Jack," Mike continued, his voice rougher now. "Most people quit when things get hard. They hit one bad break and they fold. But you keep showing up, even when you don't have to, even when nobody's watching. That tells me something about who you are." My throat tightened. I wasn't used to compliments, wasn't used to anyone seeing me as anything other than a cautionary tale. "You think I'm crazy for wanting to drive again?" I asked. "I think you'd be crazy not to, but you gotta be smarter this time. Can't just own one truck and hope for the best. You need a plan, a real one." That conversation planted something in me. A seed, maybe even hope. I started paying attention differently. When delivery drivers came to the shop, I asked them questions. How much were they making? What kind of routes? Who was hiring? I learned that small package delivery was booming, that local businesses needed reliable transport but couldn't afford the big companies, that there was a gap in the market for someone willing to hustle. Late at night, after Tommy was asleep during our weekends together, I'd sit at my tiny kitchen table with a notebook and sketch out ideas. Numbers, routes, possibilities. The math never quite worked, but I kept doing it anyway, because for the first time since the crash, I felt like I had a direction. Mike caught me one day during lunch break, scribbling in that notebook while eating a sandwich from the corner store. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the pages. "Nothing. Just ideas." He grabbed the notebook before I could stop him and flipped through it. His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. "This isn't nothing, Jack," he said quietly. "This is something." He handed the notebook back and walked away without another word. But 2 days later, he called me into his office and told me about a client who needed a rush delivery to Dallas. 300 miles. Good money. No truck required, just a reliable van and a driver willing to make the run. "You interested?" Mike asked. My heart was pounding. "I don't have a van." "I know a guy who rents them cheap. Daily rate. You'd barely break even on this first run, but it's a start." I stared at him, understanding what he was really offering. Not just a job, a chance. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Mike leaned back in his chair, that silver star tattoo visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "Because somebody gave me a shot once when I needed it most, and because I see something in you that you don't see in yourself yet. I took the job, rented the van with money I didn't have, made the delivery to Dallas and back in 18 hours straight. I barely made $50 after expenses, but it was the best $50 I'd ever earned. That first run to Dallas changed something inside me. It wasn't the money, because there barely was any. It was the feeling of being behind the wheel again, watching the highway unfold in front of me, feeling like I had a purpose beyond just surviving. For 18 hours, I wasn't Jack Morris, the broke mechanic living above a laundromat. I was Jack Morris, the driver, the man my father raised me to be. When I got back to Mike's shop and handed him the rental van keys, he just nodded and said, "Same client wants another run next week. You in?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yeah, I'm in." That second run went smoother. I learned the route, shaved 2 hours off my time, and actually made $120 profit. The third run, the client asked if I could handle a regular weekly route. By the fourth run, another business heard about me and called asking for rates. I was still working full-time at the shop, but now I was running deliveries on weekends and evenings, sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, surviving on gas station coffee and truck stop burritos. My body was exhausted, but my mind was alive in a way it hadn't been since before the crash. Tommy noticed the change. One Saturday morning, while I was planning routes at the kitchen table, he climbed into the chair next to me with his bowl of cereal. "Dad, are you a truck driver again?" I looked at his hopeful face, those bright eyes that still believed his old man could do anything. "Not yet, buddy, but I'm working on it. Grandpa would be proud," he said simply, then went back to eating his cereal like he hadn't just punched me right in the heart. That night, after Tommy was asleep, I did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not in a church or on my knees, but sitting in my beat-up Civic in the laundromat parking lot, staring up at the Texas stars. "I don't know if you're listening," I said to whoever might be up there, "but if you are, I need help. I need to know if I'm crazy for thinking I can build something real. I need a sign that this isn't just me spinning my wheels." The universe didn't answer that night, but it answered 3 days later. I was under a Dodge Ram at the shop replacing a fuel pump when Mike's boots appeared next to my creeper. "Got someone here to see you," he said. I rolled out, wiping my hands on my coveralls, and saw a woman in a business suit standing in the doorway of the shop. She looked completely out of place among the oil stains and tire racks. "Jack Morris?" she asked. "That's me. My name is Patricia Chen. I own 4 boutique furniture stores across North Texas. I heard you might be able to help me with a logistics problem." I glanced at Mike, who just shrugged and walked away. "What kind of problem?" I asked. She explained that her current shipping company was unreliable, expensive, and kept damaging her high-end furniture during transport. She needed someone local, careful, and hungry enough to treat her business like it mattered. "I can't afford the big companies," she said honestly, "and the small guys I've tried don't show up half the time." Mike said you're different, said you're building something. My heart was racing. This was bigger than anything I'd handled before. Multiple weekly runs, real money, but also real risk. "I don't have my own vehicle yet," I admitted. "I'm renting right now, but I'm reliable and I'll treat your merchandise like it's my own." She studied me for a long moment, then pulled out a business card. "Prove it. I've got a delivery next Tuesday. Fort Worth to Austin. If you can handle that without a scratch, we'll talk about a regular contract." I took the card with hands that were still shaking slightly. "I won't let you down." "I hope not," she said, "because I'm taking a chance on you based on nothing but Mike's word. Don't make him a liar." After she left, I found Mike in his office, feet up on the desk eating a sandwich. "How'd you know?" I asked. "Know what? That I could handle something like this?" Mike took a bite, chewed slowly, then looked at me with those sharp eyes. "I didn't, but I knew you'd kill yourself trying. And sometimes that's all you need to get started." That Tuesday delivery was the most stressful day of my life since the crash. I rented a box truck, spent 2 hours figuring out how to secure furniture properly, drove to Fort Worth in rush hour traffic, loaded carefully, and made the 4-hour trip to Austin going exactly the speed limit, terrified of every bump in the road. When I delivered that furniture without a single scratch, Patricia looked at me like I'd performed a miracle. "When can you start regular runs?" she asked. "Tomorrow," I said without thinking. She smiled. "Let's talk numbers." We sat in her Austin showroom and she laid out what she needed. 3 runs a week, sometimes 4. $1,000 a week minimum, more if I could handle rush deliveries. I did the math in my head. Even after rental costs, gas, and insurance, I'd be clearing more than I made at the shop. Not by much, but enough. Enough to start saving. Enough to think bigger. I need to be honest with you, I said. Right now I'm renting vehicles day by day. If I'm going to do this right, I need to buy my own truck. But I can't afford that yet. Patricia nodded. How long until you can? 6 months if everything goes perfect. Maybe a year, realistically. What if I paid you half up front for the first month? She offered. Would that help? I stared at her. Why would you do that? Because I've been where you are. 20 years ago, I was selling furniture out of my garage with a maxed-out credit card and a dream. Someone took a chance on me. Now I'm taking a chance on you. I felt something break open in my chest. Not sadness, not fear, something bigger, hope. That night I sat in my studio apartment with Tommy, and I showed him the contract I'd signed with Patricia. I explained what it meant, how it would change things, how Daddy was finally building something real. Does this mean we can get a bigger place? He asked. Eventually, yeah. Maybe even a house. With a backyard? With a backyard, I promised. He hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Over the next 3 months, I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. I'd wake up at 4 a.m., do a morning delivery, work a half shift at Mike's shop, then do evening runs until midnight. I ate while driving, slept in 4-hour chunks, and watched my bank account grow dollar by dollar. Mike eventually told me I had to choose, the shop or the road. You're building something, Jack, he said, but you can't do it halfway. You gotta commit. He was right. I gave my notice at the shop and Mike shook my hand like we were old war buddies. You're gonna make it, he said. I don't know how I know, but I do. 6 months after that first Dallas run, I had enough saved to buy my first vehicle. Not a big rig, just a used cargo van, but it was mine. Paid in cash, no bank, no loans, just sweat and miles and faith. I painted the side myself in Mike's parking lot on a Sunday afternoon. Simple block letters. Morris Freight. Tommy helped me. Got paint all over his shirt and didn't care. When we finished, I stood back and looked at it. My name, my company, my second chance. It's perfect, Dad, Tommy said. And for the first time in 2 years, I believed him. Owning that first van felt like winning the lottery, except I'd earned every dollar myself. The smell of new paint mixed with old upholstery, the engine that coughed a little before settling into a steady purr, the way my name looked on the side in those bold letters. It all meant something. It meant I was no longer working for someone else's dream. I was building my own. The first month with my own vehicle, I barely slept. Patricia's furniture routes were steady, but I knew I couldn't build a real company on one client. So I did what I'd always done. I hustled. I printed cheap business cards at the library, left them at every small business I delivered to, and asked every single client if they knew anyone who needed reliable transport. Word traveled faster than I expected. A restaurant owner needed produce delivered 3 times a week from a distributor in Waco. An art gallery needed careful transport for paintings going to a show in Houston. A medical supply company needed someone they could trust with time-sensitive deliveries. Each yes felt like another brick in a foundation I was building one load at a time. By month 3, I was turning down work because I couldn't physically do it all myself. That's when I realized I had a choice. Stay small and manageable, or take a risk and grow. I chose growth. I bought a second van with a small business loan I almost didn't qualify for. The bank officer looked at my credit history, my tax returns, and my business plan like I was asking to borrow money for a spaceship. Mr. Morris, you understand the risk here? She asked, peering at me over her glasses. Ma'am, I understand risk better than anyone in this building, but I also understand opportunity. And right now I've got more work than I can handle, and clients who trust me. I just need the vehicle to serve them. Something in my voice must have convinced her, because she approved a loan for $18,000. I walked out of that bank shaking, terrified and excited in equal measure. The second van meant I needed a second driver. I thought about posting an ad, going through resumes, doing formal interviews. But then I remembered how Mike had given me a shot when nobody else would. So I went back to the places where people like me ended up. The unemployment office, the Veterans Center, the community board at the church on 5th Street. That's where I met Marcus Webb. He was 42, former Army logistics, honorably discharged after 3 tours in Afghanistan. He'd been back stateside for 2 years and couldn't find steady work because, as he put it, nobody wants to hire someone whose resume is mostly drove trucks through war zones. We met at a diner on the edge of town. He showed up 15 minutes early, wearing a pressed shirt despite the heat, and his handshake could have crushed stone. "I'll be straight with you," I told him over coffee. "This isn't a glamorous job. The pay is decent but not great. The hours are long, and I'm still figuring this whole thing out as I go. But if you're willing to work hard and treat clients like they matter, I'll treat you like you matter." Marcus looked at me with eyes that had seen things I couldn't imagine. "How much?" he asked. I told him. He nodded once. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, 6 a.m. He showed up at 5:30. Marcus turned out to be the best decision I'd made since buying that first van. He was punctual, professional, and had this way of making clients feel important. Within a month, 3 of his clients had referred us to other businesses. Within 3 months, we needed a 3rd vehicle. This time I bought a small box truck, real cargo space, real capacity. And I needed another driver. That's when I met Sarah Castellano. She was 28, a single mother of 2 who'd been driving for a grocery delivery service that treated her like a number. She answered my ad with a handwritten letter that started with, "I'm not looking for a job. I'm looking for a chance to prove what I'm worth." I hired her on the spot. Sarah, Marcus, and I became the core of Morris Freight. We worked insane hours, covered for each other, shared tips on routes and clients, and slowly built something that felt less like a company and more like a family. On Saturday mornings, we'd meet at Mike's shop. He let us use his lot for free, and go over the week's schedule, plan maintenance, and talk about what was working and what wasn't. "You know what you're building here, right?" Mike asked me one morning, after the others had left. "A transport company?" "No, Jack. You're building loyalty. These people don't just work for you. They believe in you. That's rare." He was right. But I also believed in them. Because they were me 2 years ago. Just people who needed someone to see past their circumstances and give them a shot. The business grew faster than I could have imagined. Year 1, we did $140,000 in revenue. Year 2, $400,000. By year 3, we had 7 vehicles, 9 drivers and clients across 3 states. I moved Tommy and myself into a real house with a backyard like I'd promised. Nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom ranch with a garage where I could park the original van, the one with Morris Freight painted on the side. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. It reminded me where I'd started. But growth came with problems I wasn't prepared for. Maintenance costs, insurance nightmares, payroll, taxes, dispatch logistics, customer complaints, driver turnover. There were nights I'd lie awake doing math in my head, terrified that one bad month would collapse everything I'd built. Patricia, my first real client, noticed me struggling during a delivery one afternoon. "You look stressed," she said. "I'm fine, just growing pains." "Jack, I'm going to tell you something someone told me when I was expanding. You can't do everything yourself anymore. You need systems. You need managers. You need to work on the business, not just in it." She was right, but I didn't know how to let go. These were my clients, my trucks, my reputation. "Start with one thing," she suggested. "Find one thing you can delegate and trust someone else to do it. Then build from there." I took her advice. I hired a part-time dispatcher named Rosa, a grandmother who'd worked logistics for 40 years and knew more about routing than I'd ever learn. Within a week, she'd optimized our delivery schedule so efficiently we were completing 20% more runs with the same number of drivers. Then I brought on Tommy Chen, no relation to Patricia, as a maintenance coordinator. He was a young mechanic who'd apprenticed under Mike and knew every vehicle in our fleet by sound. Slowly, painfully, I learned to trust other people with pieces of my dream. By year 4, Morris Freight and Logistics had 19 vehicles and 23 employees. We'd expanded into warehousing and started offering logistics consulting for smaller businesses. The van I'd painted in Mike's parking lot was now joined by a fleet of trucks, each one bearing the same motto I'd decided on after that conversation with Mike years ago: keep moving forward. Those 3 words meant everything. They were my father's philosophy, my survival strategy, my promise to every driver who joined the team. One morning I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a voice said, "Is this Jack Morris from Morris Freight?" "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "This is David Brennan from Texas Monthly. We're doing a feature on emerging businesses in the state, and your company keeps coming up in our research. Would you be willing to sit for an interview?" I almost dropped the phone. The article ran 3 months later with the headline, "From Wreckage to Empire: How One Man's Crash Started Texas's Fastest-Growing Transport Company." When I read it sitting in my office, an actual office with my name on the door, I thought about that night on Highway 84. The smoke, the silence, the certainty that my life was over. And I realized something powerful. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing in disguise. You just can't see it until you're on the other side. 5 years after the crash, I found myself standing in that same spot on Highway 84 where everything had fallen apart. I'd driven out there on purpose alone, on a Tuesday evening just like the one that changed my life. The sun was setting in exactly the same way, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple that made the whole world look like it was on fire. But this time I wasn't standing next to a broken-down truck with empty pockets and a shattered future. I was standing next to a brand-new Freightliner with Morris Freight and Logistics emblazoned on the side, leading a convoy of 37 vehicles that represented everything I'd built from nothing. I'd organized this moment carefully. Every single one of my drivers was here, parked along the shoulder in a line that stretched a quarter-mile down the highway. Marcus, Sarah, Tommy Chen, Rosa, and 20 others who'd joined the family over the years. People who, like me, had needed a second chance and found it behind the wheel of one of my trucks. Tommy, my son, now 13 years old and already taller than me, stood beside me holding the old photograph I'd kept in my wallet all these years. The one of my father standing next to his truck, grinning like he owned the world. "Why'd you bring us all out here, Dad?" Tommy asked. I looked at him, this kid who'd watched me fall apart and then watched me rebuild myself piece by piece, and I realized he'd never known the full story. Not really. He knew I'd lost Grandpa's truck. He knew things had been hard. But he didn't know about the motel room where I'd considered giving up, the cold sandwiches and the math that never added up, the nights I'd cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear. "Because this is where it started," I said. "This is where I learned the most important lesson of my life." I gathered everyone around, all my drivers forming a circle on the side of Highway 84 as the sun sank lower. Some of them looked confused. Others smiled like they understood. 5 years ago, right here on this exact spot, I lost everything. I began. My truck seized up. My business died. My future evaporated. I stood here thinking my story was over, that I'd failed my father, failed my son, failed myself. I paused, looking at each face in the circle. These weren't just employees. They were proof that rock bottom could be a foundation. But here's what I didn't understand then. That crash wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the right story. Because when I had the truck, I was playing it safe. I was doing exactly what my father did, following the same path, never thinking bigger. That truck breaking down forced me to think different, to build different, to become different. Marcus nodded, his arms crossed over his chest. He understood. Sarah wiped at her eyes. She understood too. "Every single person standing here has a story," I continued. "Every one of you has faced something that could have ended you. Marcus, you came home from war and nobody would hire you. Sarah, you were working 70 hours a week for a company that didn't know your name. Tommy Chen, you were sleeping in your car while going to mechanic school." I turned slowly, meeting each person's eyes. "But you didn't stay down. You kept moving forward, and that's why you're here. Not because you're the most experienced or the most qualified, but because you're the most determined. Because when life knocked you flat, you got back up and built something better." The sun touched the horizon now, that golden hour light making everything feel sacred. "I kept that old truck," I said, pointing to the warehouse facility we'd built 20 miles from here. "It's in storage, still broken, still useless. But I look at it sometimes to remind myself that what looks like an ending is often just a sharp turn. that sometimes you have to lose the thing you're holding on to before you can grab something better. Tommy squeezed my shoulder. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's old CDL license, the one I'd carried like a talisman through every hard day. My dad wrote something on a napkin before he died. "Keep the wheels turning, Jackie. A moving truck is a living truck." I thought he meant keep driving no matter what, but I understand now what he really meant. I held up the license so everyone could see it. He meant keep moving forward in life. Don't get stuck. Don't let one setback define you. Don't confuse a temporary failure with a permanent identity. The wheels are just a metaphor. The real message is about momentum, about refusing to stay broken. I tucked the license away and looked at my team, my family, my proof that second chances are real. So I brought you all here to say thank you. Thank you for trusting me when I was still figuring it out. Thank you for working hard when the pay wasn't great and the future was uncertain. Thank you for believing that a guy who lost everything could build something worth being part of. Sarah spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. You gave us more than jobs, Jack. You gave us dignity. No, I said firmly. You always had dignity. I just gave you a chance to show it. We stood there in silence as the sun disappeared completely and the stars began to emerge. The same stars that had been there 5 years ago when I'd prayed for a sign. The same stars that had watched me fall and then watched me rise. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out a stack of envelopes from my truck. I'm giving each of you a bonus. Not because I have to, but because you've earned it. And more than that, I'm offering every driver here the chance to buy into the company, to own a piece of what we've built together. The shock on their faces was worth more than money. Morris Freight isn't just my company anymore, I explained. It's our company. Because I've learned that real success isn't measured by what you own. It's measured by what you build with others, by who you lift up, by how many people you give a second chance to. Marcus stepped forward and shook my hand, that crushing grip filled with respect and gratitude. One by one, each driver came forward. Some shook my hand, some hugged me, some just nodded, too emotional to speak. When it was over, we climbed back into our trucks and formed that convoy again, heading back toward town with headlights cutting through the darkness. I drove the lead truck with Tommy beside me in the passenger seat, and in my rearview mirror I could see the line of vehicles stretching behind us, all those lights following, all those lives connected. Dad? Tommy said quietly. Yeah, buddy. When I grow up, I don't want to be a race car driver anymore. I glanced at him, surprised. No? He shook his head. I want to build something like you did. Something that helps people. My throat tightened. I couldn't speak for a moment. You will, I finally managed. You absolutely will. That night, after dropping Tommy at home, I drove back to the warehouse alone. I walked through the rows of trucks, running my hand along the painted metal, feeling the weight of what we'd built. In the back corner, covered with a tarp, sat that original broken-down Freightliner. I pulled the tarp back and looked at it, rust and dust and memories. Thanks, old friend, I whispered. You breaking down was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it taught me that sometimes you have to fall completely apart before you can put yourself back together the right way. That rock bottom is a foundation, not a grave. That the end of one road is just the beginning of another. I thought about all the people who'd helped me along the way. Mike, who saw potential when everyone else saw failure. Patricia, who took a chance on a guy renting vans day by day. Marcus and Sarah and every driver who believed in the dream before it was real. And I thought about my father, wherever he was, hoping he could see what his broken truck had ultimately created. Not just a company, but a movement. Not just success, but significance. As I walked out of that warehouse and locked the door behind me, I realized something profound. I wasn't the same man who'd stood on Highway 84 5 years ago. That man was scared and broken and lost. This man was strong and purposeful and found. The crash didn't ruin me. It rebuilt me. And if I could go back to that Tuesday evening and prevent the engine from seizing up, prevent all the pain and struggle and fear that followed, I wouldn't do it. Because that's not how you build something real. You don't build it from comfort and convenience. You build it from wreckage and will, from broken trucks and unbroken spirits, From the moment you decide that falling down isn't the same as staying down. I climbed into my personal truck and drove home through the quiet Texas night, past the Sunset Motel where I'd lived in room 14, past Mike's shop where I'd learned to fight again, past all the landmarks of my resurrection. When I pulled into my driveway and saw the house I'd bought with money I'd earned myself, I smiled, not because I'd made it, but because I'd learned that making it isn't about the destination. It's about the journey. It's about who you become along the way. It's about how many people you bring with you. Keep moving forward. That's all any of us can do. Keep the wheels turning. Keep building. Keep believing. Keep rising. Because the road doesn't end when you crash, it just changes direction. And sometimes that new direction is exactly where you needed to go all along.